Part of the problem was, of course, the difficulty of translating a movement deeply rooted in the Greek cultural and philosophical world into the Latin one. The first significant theologian to write in Latin was Tertullian, the son of a centurion, born in the North African trading city of Carthage. He has to be seen as much as a representative of the ebullient North African Christians as of Western Christianity as a whole. Centurions were highly respected members of the Roman state, and Tertullian was well educated, able to speak both Greek and Latin. He may have trained and served as a lawyer until his conversion to Christianity, probably in the 190s when he was in his 30s, and if so, he conforms to the stereotypes of his profession in his conservatism, his rigid approach to social issues, and his ability to use uncompromising rhetoric with great emotional effect. There is something of Paul in the way that Tertullian castigates intellectuals and glories in paradox. How could one have answered his most famous statement? The Son of God died. It must needs be believed because it is absurd. He was buried and rose again. It is certain because it is impossible. Like many Latin Christians, he taunted the Greek philosophers. Wretched Aristotle, who taught them, the heretics and philosophers, dialectic, that art of building up and demolishing, self-stultifying, since it is ever handling questions, but never settling them. What is there in common between Athens and Jerusalem? He was, writes one scholar, preeminently a theologian of revelation, and an opponent of all curiositas beyond the Church's rule of faith. He had much more of the Stoic in him than the Platonist. So Tertullian helped to keep the Western Church outside the great debates over theology raging in the Eastern Empire. In general, Western theologians were wary of the more sophisticated Easterners' readiness to accept that Christian insights might be embedded in Greek philosophy. On the other hand, his attempt to formulate his own theology led him to devise specific Latin terms for Greek concepts. One of these was the word Trinitas. In his Trinity, the divine Logos exists in the mind of God from the beginning of time, but is shot out at the moment when the cosmos begins. Here are the first stirrings of a specifically Western theology, expressed in its own language rather than in translation from the Greek. Although Tertullian was to argue that Christians posed no threat to the state, in his ethical writings he portrayed the world as essentially hostile to Christians. As a Christian, one was unable ever to relax one's guard. The threat of sexual temptation in particular was ever present, and Tertullian does not seem to have believed that sexual urges could be fully tamed until old age had exhausted them. He argued that a church community should be run by the elderly, as only they might have gone beyond temptation. Tertullian contributed an abiding fear of woman as temptress to the Western tradition, and his views became more rigid with age. Beset with the continuing immorality of those around him, he came to believe that God would have to continually update his message to mankind, and in his last years he joined the Montanists, who claimed to be in direct contact with God. He passes from the scene. His last known writings date from AD 212, and the date of his death is unknown, but perhaps as late as 240. One Westerner deeply influenced by Tertullian was Jerome. In fact, much of what is known about Tertullian's life comes from Jerome himself. As has already become clear, Jerome, around 345 to 420, seems to have been an isolated and troubled individual, tormented by his sexuality, vulnerable to any hint of personal betrayal, and vituperative in response, and obsessive about the necessity for asceticism. So he is hardly an attractive figure. Yet his mastery of Latin, his native language, in which he wrote with great elegance, Greek and Hebrew, and his meticulous knowledge of the scriptures, gave him the reputation as the leading scholar of his day. His monument remains the Latin translation of the Old and New Testaments, the Vulgate, which reigned as the official Latin translation of the Bible for the Roman Catholic Church until the 1960s.